How's it, guys? Welcome to the fourth episode of the Money Marx show. This is a brand new podcast that I started where I review the budget and investments of members of my audience and then give my opinion on what I would have done in their situation. We are now at the fourth episode and this series has so far been very well received, so thank you so much for watching that. Now, as mentioned in the previous video, this series is meant to be a podcast, so meant to be listened to, but I also include the video podcast on YouTube where I will show some screenshots on the screen when I refer to specific numbers so that if you are watching this, that you can follow along. Now, I'm really excited about today's episode. I probably spent most of my Saturday morning dissecting this person's budget because although he is a very high income earner, there are many cracks in his financial situation that I feel that we need to address, and I'm really glad that he submitted his numbers because the sooner that you realize that there's a problem, the sooner we can address it and the better off he will be at the end of the day. So I really hope that you guys enjoy it and let's get started. So in today's episode, we are looking at a 37-year-old male from Cape Town. He's married with one child who is 4 months old, and he also has one dog, which is a Chihuahua. He rated his level of financial knowledge as a 5 out of 10 because he said that he only started educating himself about personal finance and investing in January of this year. He has a credit score of 666 out of 740, which is quite good. And he has a likelihood of immigrating of 5 out of 10. So basically, his story is that after he completed his studies in South Africa, he went to the UK to go and live and work there for 8 years, but then he decided to return back to South Africa. He mentioned that he really does not want to immigrate again and he wants to stay optimistic about South Africa's future. And I'm actually quite glad to see this because many of the young professionals in today's day and age want to move overseas to look for greener pastures, especially people in my age group, because, South Africa has many problems. We are all aware of that. I don't have to go into detail and list everything that's going on, but the grass isn't always better on the other side. And I do see many people coming back from overseas because you also have your own challenges that side. We can speak about this in another video another day, but it's glad to see that people are coming back because they do value what they get here more than what they can get there. Okay, so if we look at this basic info, he'll be classified as a multitasker, which means he's kind of in the middle of his career, he's earning a good income, starting a family. A couple of things that he needs to keep in mind and to focus on is paying off his debt, saving for retirement, and because he has a son, also providing for the child's education. Now, if we go onto his work information, he is a self-employed landscape architect consultant. So basically, he does freelance work in the UK, but he works from home in South Africa, which means he's earning in lekker British pounds. So that's a great hack. If you can earn in a first world currency, like the US dollar, British pound, or the euro, and you spend in South African rands, then you are much better off because you'll likely earn a much higher income and your expenses will be less than living that side. So I see a lot of people doing this, people working from home, especially in industries where you can work remotely, software engineering and architecture. So if you can find work overseas, then that's ideal because then you can kind of capitalize on the currency arbitrage of earning in a strong currency and spending in a weak currency. Now, because he is self-employed, he obviously does not work for a company, so he does not have a pension fund at work and also therefore no employer match, which basically means that he's on his own if he wants to provide for his retirement. So this is really something that we need to focus on, and it's very important that if you are self-employed or you are an employee but your employer does not offer these pension or provident workplace funds, then it is important that you sit down and you start preparing for your own retirement because there's no other backup option. Righty. So now let's see what his income is. So remember, he earns in British pounds. So his gross monthly income is 100,000 Rand. And that equates to about a net income of 69,000 Rand. He also recently started a side hustle where he opened an Etsy store where he sells digital products. Now I think this is a great idea. And I would encourage that for most people to start a side hustle and kind of using the skills that you have and combining that to create a product or service that other people will pay for. People will pay for value. So if you can provide value and you can package that in a convenient way, then people will pay for it. And the world is so connected now with the internet that anyone from anywhere around the world can create a product and sell it to anyone from anywhere around the world. So I think his skills as an architecture can really come in handy to create innovative and interesting products that he can basically sell as digital products on the internet. And we'll touch on this idea a bit later on in the video as well. Right, so because he's earning such a high income, he's in a very high marginal tax rate. So if you look at the tax brackets from such, he's in the 41% tax bracket, which is the second highest. And that is also something that we're going to focus on today. Right, so he's married, but his wife does not earn an income. We'll talk about her backstory a bit later in the video, just important to note here. Right, so because he is a high earning individual, as I mentioned, he's going to pay a lot of taxes. So it is very important that we optimize his financial situation to pay as little taxes as possible legally. Remember, there's tax avoidance and there's tax evasion. Tax evasion is illegal. You should not do that. I do not condone that. SARS will catch you and you will get a fine or go to prison. But tax avoidance is using the legal structures that the country has in place and structuring your finances in a way that you pay the least amount of taxes. And this is very important for these high earning individuals. And the second important thing is he is the sole breadwinner. He's the only one working in this family. And because he has a wife and a child, it is very important that we make sure that his risk cover is adequate. By risk cover, I mean insurance, which will cover him in the instance that he gets sick, that he cannot work, when he becomes disabled, or in the very unfortunate situation where he dies. I know we don't always want to talk about these things, but it is really important that we address them and that we make sure it is in place, because you never want to be in a situation where you wished you'd addressed this sooner. And then the other thing that is a bit more advanced that we don't always talk about. So estate planning basically means that when you die, everything that you own, which includes your savings, investments, properties, debt, all of that gets added together and that forms part of your estate. Then you will need an executor who will execute the estate. So they will basically look at what did you own, what are your assets, what are your liabilities, and then see if you have more assets than liabilities. If that's the case, then you have a balance and that gets paid out to your beneficiaries, which will basically be like your wife or your child or other dependents. But if you have more liabilities than assets, then your estate is insolvent. And that can create a problem because then they will have to sell off some of your investments to cover your debts, and that can delay the process of the estate being paid out to your dependents. So I'm mentioning it here because it will become very important later on in the video. And also with an estate, you also pay taxes. So it's not enough that you pay taxes when you're alive. You also pay taxes when you're dead. So we also need to find a way to optimize that so you don't pay as much taxes and fees as usual. Righty, so moving on to his expenses. He rents an apartment for 14,000 Rand and the apartment is in Cape Town, which includes the utilities. Now this is actually not bad. I also live in Cape Town and we're also starting looking for an apartment for next year, and it's bloody expensive. I mean, the province is growing rapidly, so I understand that. So 14,000 Rand is actually not that bad for 2 adults and 1 child, especially if it includes utilities. Then on household expenses, he pays 200 Rand. On transport, he pays 1,500 Rand because he mostly works from home, which is great. On food, they spend 10,000 Rand. This is quite a lot. They do have a child and I don't have one, so I don't really know what babies eat. I don't know if that is so expensive, but this is something that they can look at reducing. And I will link a free ebook down in the description or in the show notes of this video or podcast that I basically listed everything that I know about how to save money on various types of things, especially food. So I would encourage this individual to read through that and to find a couple of tips on how they can reduce their monthly spend on food, because 10,000 is quite a lot. On takeouts, they spend 600 Rand. Again, that is a bit high. It just depends on how many times you would like to take your wife out for dinner, I guess. And yeah, it's quite expensive to eat out. So that is potentially something that you can look at, but it's not that excessive. On alcohol, he spends 400 Rand. I mean, the guy lives in Cape Town, drinking a lekker rooi wijntjie at the end of the week is understandable, and I think that is fair. For medical and healthcare, he pays 5,500 Rand, and that is for medical aid with Discovery. That is the classic Delta Core. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on medical aids in this video because it is quite complex and there's a lot to cover. But I had a quick look at this plan and it does seem like it includes some basic cover for his wife's pregnancy and the child. So if you are thinking of starting a family, then it is important to revise your medical aid to make sure that it does cover your wife in the case that they get hospitalized for childbirth or if there are any complications, because that can get quite expensive. Okay, so the first big pain point we're gonna address today is his insurance, on which he pays 500 Rand. And that is only for the OUTsurance basic third-party cover on his car, and because he does not have comprehensive car insurance. Okay, I'm going to touch on the car insurance in just a minute, but I want to address the massive red flag that we currently have here. As you guys already know, he is a high income earner and he is the sole breadwinner. So he essentially does not have any risk cover in place. So in this case, we kind of need to ask ourselves, What will happen to his wife and his kid when he dies? What will happen when he gets disabled and he cannot continue to work? What will happen if for some really unfortunate reason he gets a terminal illness and he only has a couple of months left to live? What will happen when his house burns down? What will happen when he writes off his car? What will happen when he gets blind and he cannot perform his work as an architecture? Again, not lack of stuff to talk about, but really important to address and not be oblivious to these possible outcomes, because life do happens and these can really affect you severely, not only you, but also your family. So it is really important that he needs to address his risk cover. And by risk cover, I mean the most important that I'd say is probably life cover, because in the event that he dies, he wants to ensure that his wife and his child would be fine, not only in order to eat and to live and to maintain a similar standard of living, but also to provide for the child's education. You know, the child's only 4 months old. So later on, we'll see that one of his financial goals is to provide for his child's education, which is a noble thing to do. But you cannot provide for his education if you no longer live. So life cover will help to put money away for that instance. Also, if he has any debt, which luckily now he does not, life cover will also cover that. But if he essentially wants to buy a house or a car, which he actually does, then life cover will need to cover those debts. Because again, if he has a 3 million rand bond payment and he dies, his wife will need to pay for the house and she's not able to work. So that's very important. Second priority is income protection. So income protection is when you get sick and you cannot perform your work, it will pay out your salary. So say for argument's sake, you are insured for 30,000 rand per month and you get sick and you're sick for 10 days, you're booked off, the doctor said, no, you need to stay in bed, then income protection will pay out for those 10 days. So essentially, if you are insured for 30,000 rand a month, that's 1,000 rand a day. So you'll get paid out 10,000 rand for the day. There are different structures with income protection. Some have a 7-day waiting period. Others have a 30-day period. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but this is something that I think is very important. So those two are the most important priorities. Then what would also be a lot beneficial is to have disability cover in place. So again, if he gets disabled, he loses his arm and he cannot perform his work, then that will pay out a lump sum that he can use to kind of adapt his environment, pay off his debt, or to make their life a bit easier. And then of course, critical illness cover is that when you get an illness like cancer and you cannot work, your medical costs will go up. So you would want some cover in place that can cover those bills. Now, apart from these products, which are all classified as long-term insurance, we also need to revise his short-term insurance. So the idea behind short-term insurance is to basically replace the stuff that you've lost. So in his case, he's an architecture, so I can imagine that he has some fairly expensive equipment that he needs to use. Maybe some fancy tablet that he needs to draw on, fancy computer, you know, stuff that architects use. I don't really know what that would include, but if it's very expensive that he cannot feel confident that he will be able to replace with cash, then just adding that to your short-term household contents insurance would be a good idea. Stuff like wedding rings. It's expensive. You don't really want to buy a new one. So putting that as a separate item is also a good idea. Then touching back on his car insurance, he mentioned that he only has third-party car insurance in place. So usually with car insurance, you get two options. You get the third-party cover and then you get comprehensive car insurance. Third-party cover is basically that when you are in an accident, this insurance will pay out for the damages to the other person's car. So say you drive a Vola and you bump into a Lamborghini, then yes, obviously that would make sense to have third-party cover because the Lambo is a lot more worth than your Vola. But comprehensive car insurance is obviously a lot better because that will also cover your damages. If you are in an accident and your car gets written off, then that will cover the damages. It does sometimes get to a point where you drive such a skadonk that it's not worth it to really have comprehensive car insurance on it, because if you get in an accident, then repairing it will be more expensive than just getting a new one. So in that instance, it might make sense to just only take out third-party insurance. But if you can afford it, then comprehensive car insurance would be better. I don't know what car he drives, so I don't know what the situation is. But yeah, just something to keep in mind. And then lastly, he has a Chihuahua that also needs to eat and to play and to have a good life. And veterinary bills can sometimes get expensive. I mention this in every video because I'm also a vet, I know. So getting a basic hospital plan for his Chihuahua in place would also be a good idea. Pet insurance is not as expensive as medical insurance, but when he does get in an accident and needs to be hospitalized for a couple of days, you will be glad that you had that in place. So that's also something that I would consider. So there's quite a lot of work to do here in terms of his risk cover. So that would be the first thing that I would want to get in place as soon as possible. Right, on clothing, he spends 150 Rand. On personal care and hygiene, 300 Rand. Pet expenses, 150 Rand. Again, I think we can add some pet insurance there. Cell phone expenses, 200 Rand, which is great. Subscriptions, 740 Rand. But this does include his gym subscription, fibre, Spotify Premium, and then the UK Professional Landscape Institute subscription. So that makes sense. It's not too bad then. Banking fees, 200 Rand. That's great. Want to keep those banking fees as low as possible. And then on gifts, he doesn't spend anything, but he expects this to increase in the future. Obviously, when it's his child's birthday, he wants to add some of that for his child. And then also on childcare, he doesn't spend any money as of yet, but he does expect this to increase in the future. So at this moment, his wife is not working, so she's basically a full-time mom who is taking care of the child, and they do not have a nanny. But you know, when she starts working, they might need to get a nanny, and obviously you need to buy clothes and food and all the other stuff that children need. So that would probably increase in the future, and childcare can get quite expensive. Again, I don't have children of my own, but I know of some that does. So right, so if you look at all of these numbers, his total expenses add up to 35,090 Rand for 3 individuals, so 2 adults and 1 child, which means that his after-tax savings is 33,910 Rand, which is a savings rate of 49.1% of his net income. This is excellent. This is obviously a lot of money, but it is important that we need to put these savings to good use and not allow it to leak into all the cracks that it often does. He currently does not have any debt, but he does want to buy a house and a car in the future, and we'll get into more detail on that. Righty, so looking at his investments, starting with his short-term investments, he has a South Africa emergency savings account that has a value of 214,000 Rand, and this is in an FNB money maximizer, and his goal is to eventually get 250,000 Rand in this account, which is basically 6 months of living expenses. I also agree with that. He's self-employed and he's a sole breadwinner, so bumping up that emergency fund from 3 months to 6 months is a good idea. Then he also have an offshore savings account in the UK, which has the value of around 515,000 Rand, and this is in a Barclays savings account. Now his goal is to eventually reach 800,000 Rand in this account, which will then serve as a 20% deposit on a house, which means that he's kind of looking for a house that is worth around 4 million Rand. That is a lot of money, and we will later look if he can actually afford that. Now, because this account is still in Great British Pounds, he's hoping for the Rand to further weaken so that this value can increase. Now, that might very well happen, but I think the Rand has devalued quite a lot in the past year, mostly because a lot of bad things happen in a short period of time. So I'm hoping that it won't weaken further, but obviously if you have direct offshore investments, then that is actually good for you. Then moving on to his long-term investments, he has a retirement annuity in the Signia Skeleton Balanced 70 Fund, which has the value of 28,000 Rand. Contributes 1,000 Rand per month, and then he makes ad hoc lump sum contributions to try and lower his tax bracket. So basically what that means, the tax here in South Africa runs from 1 March to 28 February. So at the end of February, if you have some extra cash available, then dumping that into a retirement annuity will lower your taxable income, which means that you are likely to get a tax refund from SARS. Then he has a tax-free savings account with Easy Equities that has the value of 72,000 Rand. And if you look at what's in the tax-free savings account, he has the Coreshares Total Wealth ETF, the Satrix Top 40 ETF, the Satrix Property ETF, and the Signia Global Property ETF. Very similar to what I have, and obviously I think that's a good allocation. Now, he did mention that he's a bit concerned about the underperformance of the 2 property ETFs, which are both about a 5% loss. Now, this is understandable. Obviously, if you see a loss in your portfolio, it's not lacquer, but keep in mind that he only really recently started investing about the beginning of this year. This is a very short time period, so I won't be too concerned about that. Remember that if you want to invest in property or equities, which are classified as growth assets, they are higher risk investments with higher returns, which means they are much more volatile. So in the short term, you can expect some losses, but in the long term, they should outperform bonds and cash. So I won't be too concerned about this. I will just continue to contribute every single month and not obsess about my portfolio. Now, with his tax-free savings account, he doesn't contribute every month, but he contributes a 36,000 Rand lump sum on 1 March every year. So again, at the beginning of the tax year, which starts at 1 March, he contributes the maximum amount, which is the 36,000 Rand per year. Now, there are 2 strategies with your tax-free savings account. You can either do the Rand cost averaging, where you put 3,000 Rand a month into it and then kind of phase out it over the year, or you can just dump a lump sum into it. I did make a video where I compared the 2 strategies with each other and then give my opinion on which strategy would work best over the long run, and I will link it here in the description if you guys want to go check it out. But essentially, it doesn't really matter, because if you look at a tax-free savings account, it is a long-term investment which spans over several decades. So essentially, even if you contribute lump sum in amounts every single year, if we zoom out over a couple of decades, that will also be a form of a Rand cost averaging So it doesn't really matter, but it does help in the sense that you put your money in the market earlier, which means you start earning more dividends from that amount. And also you are saving on taxes because obviously it's a tax-free savings account. And those tax savings also do compound over time. So if you have the means, then going a lump sum into your tax-free savings account once a year would make sense. Just make sure that you do not exceed the 36,000 Rand per year. Otherwise, SARS will clap you with a 40% tax penalty. Then he also has some discretionary investments in his Easy Equities ZAR account. He has about 8,000 Rand in there, and that is invested in the Satrix MSCI World, Satrix Nasdaq 100, and the Satrix S&P 500 ETFs. And then he also has $210 in the Easy Equities US dollar account, and that is invested in the Vanguard US Total Stock and the Vanguard Growth ETFs. Now, I mentioned that these investments are mostly for his child's education and the car fund, which for his child education, it might make sense to keep it in the South African ZAR account and letting that grow over time. And we'll touch on that a bit later. But I don't think this is a suitable place for a car fund, because if he wants to buy a car, that will likely be a short to medium goal. And putting your money in equities or ETFs that tracks equities is not a good idea, because that's too volatile for the investment period. So for the child's education, I think that's a good idea. But for the car fund, we'll have to find another vehicle, which we'll also touch in a moment. Then you also have 12,000 Rand in an investment called peer-to-peer lending. So these are basically fractional loans where you lend money to small to medium businesses in the UK, basically a form of crowdfunding. But due to COVID, the platform no longer takes on new lending, so he's waiting for the remaining of his loans to be repaid with the interest. And he essentially wants to close this account and then move the money over to the Easy Equities discretionary account. So yeah, this is basically some form of investment in the UK that we don't really have here in South Africa. So I'm not going to go into much detail on that. Transferring that money to South African rands and then using that here makes sense. Then at the moment, he does not have any property investments, but he is thinking of using the Easy Properties platform for diversification purposes. And one of his financial goals is to eventually buy a house that has income generating potential, such as a granny flat or dual living, to help pay off his house bond quicker. Now, I think this is a great idea. If you can buy a house and you can rent out granny flats, or kind of buy a big house and you divide it into two and you rent out the other part, that is a good financial move and it will help you to pay off the bond quicker. You're just going to have to live with other people that you might not necessarily want to, but that is a small sacrifice to make in order to pay off a bond. Then he has about 1,000 Rand in crypto that he contributes 500 Rand per month. So he essentially just mentioned that he has this in place because he doesn't want to get FOMO, and that's good to see. It's nice to put little amounts into it if you want to. You know, if it goes to the moon, then great, you get a lacquer boost on your investments. If it crashes, then it's not going to bankrupt you. I mean, 500 Rand per month on his salary is 0.5%. So that is low enough for these speculative types of investments. So if you add all of these together, he has an investment portfolio value of 853,000 Rand. And if you look at the allocation, that is divided as 11.7% that goes towards retirement funds, 2.9% that goes towards discretionary funds, that is for his child's education basically, and then 85.4% in cash. That is very high. He's 37 years old, so he has a good 28 years until retirement, which is a long period. So I understand that a big goal that he has is to put down a large deposit on a house and to buy a new car. And for that, his waiting in cash is quite a lot. But still, this is very high for someone his age. And we need to find a way to balance that out and allocate more money towards growth assets that can actually grow and beat inflation. Because this 85.4% of his money is getting eroded by inflation every single day. Alrighty. So now for the exciting part of the video. We are going to look at his financial goals and we are actually going to do some calculations to see if he's able to reach these financial goals. And then we're going to look at all of his monthly premiums to see if he can actually afford them, and then kind of prioritize them to see if he can actually afford all of these goals that he has. So first up, he has the emergency fund, of which he wants 250,000 Rand invested in, which is the 6 months expenses. And he basically needs another 40,000 Rand. So if you make a couple of assumptions like a 7% for inflation and the 7.5% growth rate, which is a bit higher than inflation, and we want to achieve this 6-month emergency fund within 1 year, this means his monthly premium would be 3,296 Rand. Now, a good place to store an emergency fund would be something like a bank savings account or a money market fund, because you essentially want liquidity, you want it to be low cost, and you want your capital to be guaranteed. So putting it in a bank account or a money market unit trust would be a good idea. Now, his second short-term goal is to put an 800,000 Rand deposit on a new house, and his financial goal is to reach this within 12 months. Now, he already has 500,000 Rand. So he essentially needs another 300,000 Rand. Now again, if we make some assumptions and we say inflation would be 7% and we expect a 7.5% growth rate from something like a money market account, then that means that if he wants to achieve this deposit within 12 months, he will need to save a premium of 25,377 Rand per month. This is a lot and not something that he can afford. And we'll get to that in a minute. Right, then moving on to his medium-term goals. He wants to buy a new car with a bigger boot because, he's getting a family and he's looking to buy a car that is valued at 250,000 Rand today, and that would be in about 3 years. So again, if we assume an inflation rate of 7%, an 8.5% growth rate, and a 7% premium escalation rate, that means that you will need to start saving a monthly premium of 6,975 Rand in order to buy this 250,000 Rand car in 3 years' time cash. Now, an investment period of 3 years is kind of like a medium-term goal. So putting that in a bank savings account or a money market fund would not be appropriate because you can take on a little bit more risk because your investment period is a bit bigger. So for around 3 years investment goal, I would personally look at something like the South African Retail Savings Top-Up Bond, which currently offers 9.75%, and you can contribute every single month, and then they pay out the capital and interest after 3 years. Or you can look at something like an income fund unit trust. So for example, the Coronation Strategic Income Fund. This is still a conservative and a defensive fund, and they basically invest most of the money in income producing assets such as cash and bonds and a bit of property. This will typically give you a higher return than a money market or bank savings account, but it has slightly more risk that some of the companies that issue the bonds defaults. It's a very low risk, but it's still present. So you just need to take that into account. But for a 3-year period, you can take on some volatility. And then moving on to his long-term goals. First one is his child's education. And he basically looked at what he wants to provide for his child. So he mentioned that he wants a 6-year degree. So basically the 4 years undergrad and 2 years postgrad tertiary education. And in today's terms, that's about 60,000 Rand per year. And obviously the child is only 4 months old, so investment period would be about 18 years. Now what is really important to realize here is that the cost of education is far outpacing general inflation. So where inflation would be 6 to 7%, education is likely to be 9 to 10%. And this is something that we don't always realize because, if your child is born, you don't really think about saving for their tertiary education 18 years down the line. But as you will see in a moment, you need to start thinking about that the day they are born, because it will be bloody expensive in 18 years' time, especially if we look at today's terms. So to give you an example, if we assume inflation was 7%, then it's always good to add about 2 to 3% on top of that to get to the graduflation rate. So in this instance, we'll assume an investment growth rate of 9% because again, this is a longer investment period. So we're going to invest in more aggressive funds that would likely give us a higher return. And then the premium growth rate would also be 7%. That's just basically every year we're going to add a little bit more to keep up with inflation. Now, if we put this into a calculator, this means that the future value, so meaning the amount that he will need in the 18 years time to fund this 6-year degree, would be 1.8 million Rand in the future value. So that's money in 18 years time. And if we are going to start saving today, that means he will need to invest 2,145 Rand today to be able to provide for his child's future for a 6-year degree that's valued as of 350,000 Rand today. This is sometimes difficult for people to understand because you get the present value of money, you get the future value of money, and inflation erodes the value of money. So that basically means that your 100 Rand today will not be worth the same in 18 years time, and what you can afford today would not be able to afford in 18 years time. So again, his child is basically a newborn, but even if he wants to provide his child with a proper tertiary education, from the day that he's born, he'll need to save more than 2,000 Rand. And I really hope that if you have a family or you're thinking about starting a family, then this is really important to take note of because you need to start saving early. And the 18 years of compound growth on those savings would be massive and would be able to provide that education that your child needs. Now, again, this is a long-term investment period, so we can look at a bit more aggressive funds. So putting it in a discretionary investment, such as the Easy Equities ZAR account, would be a good idea. Looking at well-diversified ETFs or unit trusts, basically ETFs that tracks equities and some offshore exposure would be a good idea. And that will mostly be for the first 15 years. And then in the last 3 years, we can start tapering it down to more conservative funds, something like bonds or cash, because we don't want to keep it in equities for the full 18 years and then need to sell off investments to fund the education. Because if there's a market crash just before the child goes to university, then he might need to realize some losses. So first 15 years, by all means, go aggressive. And then the last 3 years, taper down to more conservative funds. Now, some of you might wonder, should you use the child's tax-free savings account allocation for this? And the answer is a clear no. Don't use your child's tax-free savings account for their educational purposes, because that lifetime allocation is theirs, it's not yours. And if you're going to save for education and you're going to withdraw all of that money, that will be a big disservice to your child. So please do not use your child's tax-free savings account to fund their education. If you want to help them to retire, then yes, and you do have the means, then by all means, deposit money into the tax-free savings account to help them out, but do not put it there to eventually pull it out again. Remember, a tax-free savings account is a long-term investment and we need to keep it for the long term, because if we remove money, then it's not going to be as powerful as it's meant to be. And then lastly, let's look at his retirement provisions. So currently he has about 125,000 Rand saved, and he has a monthly contribution of 4,000 Rand towards his retirement annuity and his tax-free savings account. So if we make a couple of assumptions, let's say he wants to retire at the age of 65 and live until the age of 85. We assume inflation would be 7% and that his contribution growth rate would also be in line with inflation, which is also 7%. Let's assume that his investments will grow at a rate of 9% before retirement and 8% after retirement. Remember that if you retire, you're going to need to reduce your risk exposure a bit, because you're going to need to draw an income. So we're going to put it in a bit more conservative funds, hence why the lower expectation growth rate. And then we're also going to presume that he wants an income after retirement of 40,000 Rand per month in today's terms, and that there will not be any capital requirements. So if you put all of this into a calculator, that means that in about 27 years time, he would have provided capital of 13 million Rand, but he would require capital of 58.5 million Rand. That means there's a capital deficit of 45.5 million Rand, which essentially means that if he retires at the age of 65, he will basically run out of money within 5 years of retirement. And as bad as that might seem, it's good that we know about this so that we can start addressing this issue early on and allow him to eventually retire comfortably. So if we kind of want to make up for that difference, he will need to start investing 15,700 Rand per month towards his retirement in order to live those 20 years. Again, guys, we don't always think about this because we think retirement is some distant thing that we'll worry about when we get there. But if you don't address this early enough, then you will get into trouble and you will run out of money. So this is why we need to address this early on. Now, he doesn't want to emigrate, so we can look at South African-based retirement plans. So obviously, maxing out the tax-free savings account every single year, which is 36,000 Rand, and then putting a lot of money into retirement annuities. And I also think that once his wife is able to also open retirement accounts, we also need to look at providing for her retirement as well. And I'll elaborate on that in a moment. Now, obviously, there are a couple of pain points that we need to address now. But before we get onto that, I just want to have a quick discussion on his personal situation, because it's sometimes easy to look from the outside and then judge a person's situation, but it is really important with personal finances to understand a personal situation, essentially. Now, he mentioned that he thinks he needs some catching up to do when it comes to investing and that he wished he started sooner. He only started investing in January of this year, after the birth of his son, because that kind of triggered something in his mind that he needs to start taking his finances seriously, because he wants to obviously provide for his wife and his child. Before that, he found investing to be quite intimidating, and hence why he shied away from educating himself. He has been living frugally and saving for a house deposit for the last 5 years, and his main investment goals is to buy their forever home, to save for their child's tertiary education, to buy another second-hand car, and to save for retirement. Now, it's important to understand where he's coming from and what his relationship with money is, because we were all differently brought up and we all have different journeys. And it's important to meet someone where they are at in order to understand how they think about money and then meet them there and grow and build with them. So all things considered, I've listed a couple of pain points that we need to address in order of priority. So obviously, first thing, he has inadequate risk cover. So we need to look at his income protection, life cover, disability cover, severe illness cover, and short-term insurance. Make sure he has enough cover in place to look after his family when he's gone or when he gets disabled, to make sure that they will eventually be okay. And as you've seen, we also looked at all of his financial goals, and we actually ran the numbers to see what he will need to pay every single month in order to achieve them. So just to revise, he has the emergency fund, that is 3,296 Rand, a house deposit of 25,377 Rand, a second-hand car of 6,975 Rand, child's education of 2,145 Rand, and retirement planning of 15,700 Rand per month. That adds up to a total monthly premium of 53,493 Rand. And although he does have a savings of 33,900 Rand per month, that is still a deficit of 19,593 Rand. So obviously, he's not able to afford all of these premiums. And it's really important that we run the numbers, because sometimes in our minds, especially if we earn a lot of money, we think that, yeah, I can afford this and I can afford that and I can afford this, because each one individually looks okay to be able to afford. But if we actually put in the numbers and we put everything on paper and you look at the total amount, you realize that, oh shit, I can't afford all of this. I will need to prioritize, and not only prioritize his monthly premiums, but also we are going to need to revise his budget, because we need to get those risk cover in place, and we also need to look at what he expects to pay on child support, and then eventually, after taking those two into consideration, see what he can save every single month, and then use that money to see which premiums he can afford. So for example, after revision, what I would do, in my opinion, and again guys, not financial advice, financial education, I'm just giving my opinion on his specific situation. I would prioritize my emergency fund, that 3,296 Rand per month, getting that to the 6 month worth of living expenses, and then you're done with that. Secondly, I would prioritize retirement, that 15,700 Rand per month. Do not be oblivious to retirement provisions, because the later you start, the more you'll need to contribute every single month. So that would definitely be on my priority list. Third priority would be the child's education, the 2,145 Rand per month. Again, the earlier you start, the better you'll be. And that is part of his own personal goals. And he really wants to provide for his child. So that's good to add that there. And then that leaves us with the car and the house. Now, obviously, he cannot afford both, at least not in the sense that he wants to at the moment. So for the car, I would probably look for a cheaper option and only upgrade if it's really necessary. If his car is really not able to drive anymore, I mean, having a bigger boot is lacquer and ideal, but if it's not really necessary, then that would probably not make financial sense to upgrade. And then obviously, I think his biggest pain point is his house. I know they mentioned that they wanted to buy their dream house, but looking at the numbers, they were looking for a house of around 4 million Rand. Now, although in Cape Town that is not as much, it is quite a lot of money, and definitely something that they cannot afford given their current financial situation. So either they will have to look for a smaller house, a cheaper area, delay the purchase, or continue to rent. And remember guys, when you buy a house, it's not only the deposit you put down or the monthly bond repayment, you're going to pay transfer duty, transfer costs, you're going to pay bond registration costs, which add up quite a lot. And then you also have maintenance and insurance and all of that. So I don't think that the house should be a priority at this stage. I think we need to get all of the other stuff in place, revise his budget, and then see if he's actually able to afford one. And if he is, we need to carefully consider what he can afford and not just go blindly into it. Obviously, if he walks into a bank right now, then the bank will probably approve him for that loan because they don't know what his financial situation looks like. But that would be a dire financial mistake because he will not be able to keep up with everything, especially if he's not able to earn an income. Now let's address his wife's situation. So just in short, his wife is a Polish national. She's currently on a temporary relative's spousal visa, and that means she does not have a bank account or an ID number in South Africa. She's still waiting for a permanent residence spousal visa, and once she gets that, she'll be legally allowed to work. And once she gets that, she'll be legally allowed to work and eligible to pay taxes. She does have some savings, but that is in a bank account in the UK. Now, in this situation, it's really important to take the wife's financial situation in account as well, because she's a foreign national, she's not able to work, and she stays at home looking after the child. And it just depends on the marriage regime that they signed, if they were married in community of property or out of property, with the accrual, without the accrual. Again, can make a separate video on that. But in this case, he is the sole breadwinner and she is looking after the child. So you will need to also take her into consideration and start preparing for her retirement provision as well. Again, something that we don't always want to talk about, But what is still important is if you are married, then we need to make provisions for all types of scenarios. For example, in the instance that it happens that for some unfortunate reason they need to divorce, then she will basically have nothing in place. That will cause her to be set back in life severely. So we need to take that into consideration as well. Now, I know that she's not legally able to work, but I do think that she can help with the Etsy store that we mentioned earlier in the video, the kind of side hustle that they put up, because she can help to set that up and to run the business, and she can basically help him to get that up and running and then start earning an income for the family. Again, the world is so connected. She's working from home and she probably has some time throughout the day to help with that. And that can also help her to start contributing towards the household income and to improve the overall income that they earn. And then another very important thing, they do not have a will in place. The reasoning is that he assumed that if he dies tomorrow, his wife would be able to get what's sitting in his bank accounts and investments. No, it does not work like that. If you do not have a will in place, that means there's no written or recorded instructions of what you would have want your assets to be allocated towards. So what will happen in this case is if he dies today, under the South African law, his estate, which remember is basically everything that he owns, would be distributed according to the laws of interstate succession. What that means is the state, South African government, will allocate his assets according to a default method that might be different to what he actually wanted. The state will also need to appoint an executor to wind up their estate, and this could be some random guy that they have no personal relationship with, and that can actually make this guy a lot more expensive than what they would have paid. And that can put some extra stress on the family, because not only do they have to deal with the death of their main breadwinner, but they also have to deal with this stranger that does not know their personal circumstances. And if the estate is insolvent, this will cause unnecessary delays for the money to be paid out, which again would cause a lot of stress on the family because they won't be able to actually get that money. So this is again where estate planning is very important. Now, if you have like simple finances, then most likely be okay to just download a template from the internet and sign that and keep that as your will. But in his case, his finances are a bit more complicated because remember, he's married, he has a child, his wife is a foreign national, and he has some offshore accounts. So in his case, I would rather pay a bit more money and consult a legal professional who would be able to take all of these things into consideration and draft a proper will. So this is something that's very urgent that needs to get in place in order to be able to provide for his family. And then obviously we saw that in terms of his retirement planning, we need to address that as well. So maxing out the tax-free savings account and invest as much as possible into retirement annuities. If you guys remember, when you contribute towards your retirement annuities, you reduce your taxable income, which means you pay less taxes. Again, he is in a very high tax bracket, so we need to reduce that in order to save some money. And whilst doing this, we need to keep the wife into account as well and start investing for her as well. So once she gets her permanent visa, open a bank account and investment accounts and start contributing towards her investments as well. With a tax-free savings account, we are limited to 36,000 Rand per year per individual, but obviously once she's eligible, maxing out her tax-free savings account as well and start contributing towards her retirement annuity if she's able. And then touching on the investment allocation, it was 85.4% in cash, way too conservative. He still has 28 years to retirement, so we need to increase his exposure to growth assets like equity and property, because apart from the car and the house, most of his goals are long-term goals, so we need to go as aggressive as possible to get the highest possible returns. And then lastly, touching on the taxes again, he's a high income earner, he's in a very high marginal tax bracket, and also he has a very large holding in cash. So when you have investments in cash, you earn interest and you pay interest tax. Now we do get an annual interest tax exemption of 23,800 Rand, but if you exceed this, then that interest is added to your marginal tax rate, in which he pays 41%. So again, that's why we need to reduce that cash holding, because he's likely exceeding that 23,800 Rand per year. And that basically means that half his returns in his cash accounts are going towards taxes, and taking taxes and inflation and fees into account, he is losing a lot of money just by having that large amount of cash. We don't always know about this. Right, so tying everything together, a couple of general recommendations. I would recommend that he tries to improve his credit score. Remember, it's 666 out of 740, which is good, but we can still improve it, especially if he wants to eventually buy a house. Now, he mentioned that he's not keen on getting a credit card, as his philosophy is that if he doesn't have the cash right now, that he doesn't want to buy it. And I understand that makes sense, that's good. But having a credit card does not mean you need to go into debt. and pay interest on that. It just means you treat it exactly like a debit card. You swipe for only things that you need and you pay it off at the end of the month. If you can use your credit card responsibly, that will help you to build up your credit score, and you might also get some cashback bonuses on some of the banks. So I would encourage him to get a credit card, but treat it as a debit card. So if you swipe 100 Rand for sokkies, then transfer 100 Rand from your current or check account towards your credit card account so that you don't pay any penalties. And then for the expenses, you can maybe cut down on some of the food or takeouts to save some money. And then overall, I think in his situation, it would be very valuable to consult a financial planner, because a financial planner, as I've shown in this video, has access to a lot of tools and calculators, which means that he can perform a detailed financial needs analysis, which will include a retirement and risk analysis. And if we can pull all the information that we have on this individual, we'll be able to see where he's lacking some cover, or if he's not able to provide for certain investment goals, and then we can address it early on. So that a financial planner would be able to look at his risk planning, retirement planning, his tax planning. Again, he's paying a lot of taxes, and there are many different ways to reduce the amount of taxes he pays, which means he'll have more disposable income to spend on stuff that he actually cares about. And then most importantly, setting up that will and making sure his estate is well structured. Because again, in the very unfortunate situation where he dies, there will be a lot of financial hardships for his family. So that is something that will need to be urgently addressed. And a financial planner would also be able to kind of provide that objective overview on his goals, looking at everything and seeing if he's on track on meeting his investment goals. Remember, his child's education, the purchase of his car, and the potential house purchase. And he'll also make sure that all of these investment goals are invested in appropriate vehicles and in the appropriate asset classes. Again, we talked about short-term goals, medium goals, long-term goals. You don't invest the same for all of these. You look at the investment period and you look at the risk tolerance, and then you decide. So a financial planner can provide that objective opinion and can basically take out emotion out of these decisions, because we are very emotional about our own money and we make emotional, erratic decisions. We are human, we do that. I don't care who says what, we are still humans, and sometimes life happens and we do stupid things. So having that objective overview of someone telling you, relax, we have everything under control, or even, shit, we have some problems that we need to address, then that's good to know that there's someone looking and keeping track of that. You know, a financial planner that has experience in the business field would be able to help draft the business plan to help his wife get started to earn an income, you know, through the Etsy store, or to explore other revenues that she might find interesting and to start contributing towards the household income. And then lastly, just setting and keeping realistic expectations. I think this guy is doing a great job. He's earning a lot of money and he obviously cares a lot about his family. And I'm really glad that he started prioritizing his finances and that he realized that that is something that needs to be addressed. It's never too late to start, and I want you guys to realize that, because the best time to plant a tree is today, not tomorrow. Wherever you are in your financial situation, please never feel like you are drowning or you are stuck or you are in a black hole that you don't know how to get out, because the best thing that you can do is actually to start looking at your finances and maybe get someone to help you, because just being oblivious to the fact and ignoring it will not help. It's never too late to start making a difference, and you will never regret at least looking at your finances and trying to find a way to improve it. Sure, this was a long one. Wow. I think there were a lot of important things that were covered in this video. I really hope that you guys enjoyed it. And if you guys have any questions, then make sure to gooi them in the comments. You must all have a lekker day. Cheers.